A young child's powerful words echoed in the air. Mommy had just left the courtroom, her face a mix of disbelief and shock. The atmosphere in the room was heavy, almost suffocating, as if every single person was holding their breath in unison. The fluorescent lights above cast a harsh, unfeeling glow over the wooden panels of the courtroom walls, amplifying the coldness of the moment. Strangers filled the benches, a blend of curious spectators and a few family members, their faces a collection of silent judgments. On the far left of the room, there was a little black boy, no older than 4 or 5, his legs too small to reach the ground. He swung them back and forth nervously, his sneakers softly tapping the polished wood beneath him. Sitting beside him was his mother, dressed in a navy blazer that seemed slightly too big, as though she had borrowed it just for this day. Her hair was carefully styled, and her makeup was subtle yet flawless, as she gripped a tissue in one hand, her gaze shifting constantly to the lawyer sitting near her. The lawyer spoke quietly, offering reassurance now and then, but the boy, he was different. With wide brown eyes, he observed every detail in the room. There was a certain innocence in his face, but the furrowed brow suggested a deep concern, a worry far too heavy for someone of his age. Across from them, a man sat with his own lawyer. He was tall, white with graying hair, his posture rigid, a visible tension in his every movement. His suit looked expensive, precisely tailored, but his face was tight with something deeper than nerves. This wasn't just another legal dispute for him. It was personal. He was the boy's father, and today he was fighting for custody. In the center of it all, the judge sat with a steely, unyielding expression. She was a woman in her 60s, her eyes sharp and calculating, carrying the weight of her years of experience like armor. Her face remained unchanged, stoic as she took in every word, every movement in the room. She had presided over countless cases, yet something about this one felt different. Perhaps it was the unspoken truths that seemed to hang in the air, making everything feel far more intense than it appeared on the surface. Perhaps it was the restless movements of the little boy that caught the judge's attention. The courtroom fell into a tense silence as she adjusted her glasses and slowly turned her gaze toward the mother. "You may proceed," she said, her voice unwavering, filled with authority. The mother, visibly shaken, cleared her throat and straightened up, gripping her tissue more tightly, as the sound of her lawyer's chair scraping against the floor broke the stillness. He rose to begin his questioning, but no one in that room, not even the judge, could have foreseen what was about to unfold. The boy's wide, alert eyes, filled with a silent anxiety on the brink of tears, spoke volumes. There was something unspoken in his gaze, as if the truth he knew was about to come to light, and it was only a matter of time before it was revealed. The lawyer began his questioning, his voice measured, deliberate, as though he were pacing the scene with calculated steps. "Miss Hamilton," he said, stepping closer to the witness stand, "please tell the court why you believe you should have full custody of your son." The mother straightened her back, her voice soft but resolute. "Your Honor, I've been my son's primary caregiver since the day he was born," she began, her words deliberate. "I've cared for him, provided for him, and made sure he has everything he needs to grow and thrive." She paused for a moment, her gaze drifting toward the little boy sitting quietly on the bench, drawing strength from the sight of him. "I know his routines, his fears, his dreams. I've sacrificed my career, my personal life, everything I had, just to make sure he feels safe and loved." Her words were measured, almost rehearsed, but they carried a deep emotional weight, each sentence cutting deeper than the last. She dabbed at her eyes with her tissue before continuing, her voice barely steady now. "I don't deny that his father cares for him, but the truth is, he hasn't been there. Not in the way that our son deserves. He's missed birthdays, school events, even doctor's appointments. A parent can't just pick and choose when to show up." The father's lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, bracing for his rebuttal. But Miss Hamilton wasn't finished. "I'm not perfect, Your Honor," she said, her voice cracking just a little, "but everything I do for my son. He's my entire world." The room fell silent, save for the quiet scratching of the judge's pen on paper. The boy sat still, staring at his shoes, but his posture had shifted. His shoulders were tighter now, his small hands clenched into fists in his lap. The mother's lawyer wrapped up his questioning. "Thank you, Miss Hamilton," he said, his tone firm but kind. "Your Honor, it's clear who has the child's best interests at heart." The judge gave a slight nod, signaling that it was time for the next phase. But then, in the thick silence that followed, the boy's small voice rang out, cutting through the room like a sharp blade. "Mommy's lying." It wasn't loud, but it was loud enough to send shockwaves through the courtroom. Everyone turned toward him, and the mother's face drained of color. Even the judge seemed taken aback, her pen halting mid-stroke. No one understood the gravity of those two words. Not yet. The room froze. The boy's voice, trembling but resolute, pierced the stillness once more. "Mommy's lying," he repeated, his words heavy with something deeper, something the room couldn't ignore. All eyes were on him now, the judge leaning in slightly, her expression unreadable, though it was clear that she was now completely focused on the boy. The mother whipped her head toward him, her composure beginning to crack under the weight of his words. "Honey," she said, her voice low and urgent, "this isn't the time for you to speak." But the judge, calm and commanding, interrupted her. She fixed her gaze on the boy, her eyes softening just enough to encourage him to continue. "What do you mean, young man? Why do you think your mommy is lying?" she asked gently, her tone encouraging but firm. The boy's small hands fidgeted nervously in his lap as he glanced back and forth between his mother and the judge, clearly torn between the two. Tears welled up in the boy's big brown eyes, but he didn't retreat. He stared at the floor, his voice small but unwavering. She says everything is for me," he started, his words barely above a whisper. "But it's not true." He took a deep breath before continuing. She doesn't even like me talking to Daddy." A sharp gasp rippled through the courtroom, and the father leaned forward, his eyes wide, as though he couldn't believe what he was hearing. The mother's face went pale, frozen in panic. Her lips parted as if to argue, but no sound came out. The boy, gathering courage, pressed on. "She tells me Daddy is bad. She says he doesn't love me. But that's not true. Daddy always tries to call me. He sends me letters and pictures, but she hides them." The judge raised an eyebrow, her gaze shifting to the mother, who now looked like the floor beneath her was about to give way. The father's lawyer immediately pounced on the moment, his voice firm and urgent. "Your Honor, this is a significant statement. May I request that the court allow this child to elaborate?" The judge nodded slightly, her attention fixed on the boy. "Take your time, sweetheart. Tell us everything you feel comfortable sharing," she said, her voice softening. The boy hesitated, his little lip quivering, then his eyes flickered to his mother, the weight of his words hanging on his shoulders. "She told me to say bad things about Daddy," he said, his voice barely audible now. "She said if I didn't, I might not get to stay with her." A low murmur spread across the courtroom, and the judge's gavel came down sharply. "Order! Order in the court!" she commanded. The mother's lawyer shot to his feet, his voice frantic and desperate. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." "Sit down," the judge snapped, her tone cold and unyielding. Then she turned back to the boy, her expression softening once again. "You're doing very well. Is there anything else you want to share with us?" she asked gently. The boy nodded, his tiny shoulders rising and falling with the weight of the moment. He took a deep breath. "I just want to see my daddy. I miss him." And as those words hung in the air, the mother's perfectly crafted story began to crumble, piece by piece. The courtroom stood in stunned silence, the gravity of the boy's words settling over everyone like an unshakable fog. The judge leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing slightly as she processed everything that had just been revealed. "Miss Hamilton," she said, her voice calm but deliberate, as she turned to the mother. "Do you have a response to your son's statement?" The mother, visibly rattled, struggled to maintain her composure. Her hands trembled as she gripped the tissue, her knuckles turning white. "Your Honor," she stammered, He's just a child. He doesn't understand the full situation. My only goal has always been to protect him." The father's lawyer immediately cut in, his voice firm with accusation. "Protect him, Your Honor. This boy's testimony suggests a deliberate attempt to turn him against his father. We request that the court take this revelation seriously and reconsider the evidence presented." The judge raised a hand, silencing the room. She turned her gaze back to the boy. "Do you feel safe right now, sweetheart? You can tell me anything," she asked, her voice full of reassurance. The boy nodded, but his eyes darted between his mother and the judge, his voice barely a whisper. "I feel safe, but I don't like when Mommy says those things about Daddy. He didn't miss my birthday. He came to the school to give me a card, but Mommy said I wasn't allowed to see him." Across the courtroom, the father's face twisted with a mixture of shock and heartbreak. He placed his hand over his mouth, trying to contain his emotion, but his eyes never left his son. His lawyer leaned over to whisper something in his ear, but the father's focus remained fixed on the boy. The judge, scribbling down a few notes, turned to the court clerk. "I'd like to review all communication records between both parents," she ordered, her voice commanding. "Phone logs, emails, anything relevant to this case." The mother's lawyer shot to his feet again, his voice trembling but determined. "Your Honor, I must object to this line of inquiry. My client has complied with all custody agreements, and there's no concrete evidence to support these accusations." But the judge wasn't swayed. "Your client's compliance is precisely what's in question, Counselor," she said sharply. Then, turning back to the boy, she asked, "Is there anything else you want to share? Anything about how you feel, or something that you want?" The boy hesitated again, his hands twisting nervously in his lap, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. With a deep breath, the boy looked up, his voice trembling but clear. "I love Mommy, but I love Daddy too," he whispered, his words heavy with emotion. "I just want them to stop fighting." A ripple of emotion swept through the courtroom, a mixture of sorrow and admiration for the boy's bravery. The judge, her expression softening, nodded toward him. "Thank you for being so brave," she said gently. "You've done a very good job today." But as the boy's simple yet profound wish echoed in the room, it was evident that the battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. The courtroom fell silent once again, the weight of the moment hanging heavily in the air. The judge leaned back in her chair, hands clasped together, her gaze unwavering as she studied both parents. The mother, pale and shaken, looked as if her composure had cracked in that single moment. The father, frozen in place, wore a mixture of hope and devastation on his face, the realization of what had just transpired sinking in. For the first time in this trial, the layers of carefully crafted stories from both sides were being stripped away, unraveling under the weight of raw truth, spoken by a child who simply wanted peace. The judge cleared her throat, her voice firm and resolute. "This court takes the well-being of children very seriously," she began, her tone measured. "The statements made here today cannot be ignored." She paused. "I am ordering a temporary recess to review the evidence and allow both parties time to reflect on the impact their actions have had on this child." She banged her gavel, signaling the break, and the courtroom filled with hushed whispers as people began to file out. The mother was the first to reach her son, crouching down to his level, her voice strained but soft. "Why would you say that, sweetheart? You know I love you." The boy's lips quivered, but he didn't respond. He simply stared at his shoes, his small shoulders sagging, weighed down by guilt and confusion that he couldn't yet fully understand. Across the room, the father took a tentative step forward, his heart aching as he crouched down beside his son. "I'm proud of you," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "That took a lot of courage." The boy's eyes filled with tears as he looked up at his father. "I just want you and Mommy to stop being mad," he whispered. The father's face twisted with emotion, his heart breaking as he nodded slowly. "I know, buddy. I know." From her bench, the judge watched the exchange with a thoughtful expression, her mind processing everything she had just heard. When the court reconvened, she addressed the room with a sense of finality. "I've reviewed the evidence," she said, her voice steady. and I've taken into account the testimony from the child. It's clear that the current arrangement is not in this boy's best interest." The mother gasped, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table, her breath shallow. "Shared custody will be reinstated immediately," the judge continued, her words cutting through the tension, "with clear stipulations for co-parenting, communication, and counseling for both parties. This child deserves to have both parents in his life, free from manipulation or interference." The mother's lawyer whispered urgently in her ear, but she hardly seemed to hear him. Her gaze remained locked on her son, who now looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Was it relief? Sadness? Disappointment? The father exhaled slowly, his body relaxing as the weight of the decision began to settle in, though the tension in his shoulders remained. The boy, sitting quietly between them, his small hands gripping the edge of his seat, didn't fully grasp what had just happened. But he felt the shift in the air, the change that had taken place. Even as the gavel came down again, signaling the end of the hearing, it was clear that the real work, the hard work, was only just beginning for all of them, for the parents, for the boy, and for everyone who had witnessed the truth finally rise to the surface. As the courtroom began to empty, the air was thick with the murmur of whispered conversations, the sound of briefcases snapping shut, and the heavy footsteps of lawyers heading for the door. The boy stood between his parents, his tiny hand clutched tightly in his father's. His mother hovered just behind them, uncertain and silent. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The weight of the judge's ruling settled over them like a thick fog, its implications stretching out in all directions, the future uncertain, but the truth, raw and undeniable, now inescapable. Like a fragile truce, the father lowered himself to his son's eye level, a tired but genuine smile slowly emerging through his weariness. "You were really brave today," he said softly, his voice full of pride. "You told the truth, and that's not always easy." The boy's lip trembled, but he nodded. "I just don't want anyone to be mad anymore," he murmured. The father's smile faltered, sadness flickering across his face, but he nodded firmly, his hand gently resting on his son's small shoulder. "We'll work on that, I promise," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. The mother, who had been standing at a distance, shifted uncomfortably. Her carefully curated appearance had unraveled. Her makeup had smeared, her blazer hung loosely from her shoulders, and her eyes were red from the weight of the moment. She stepped closer, her voice tentative, almost fragile. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," she said, each word laced with regret. "I shouldn't have said the things I did. I was wrong." For a moment the boy's expression remained unreadable. His gaze flickered between his mother and father, and then with a simple but profound gesture, he reached out and gently took her hand. "It's okay, Mommy," he whispered. "I just want us to be happy." Those words hit her like a punch to the gut. They were simple, yet carried the weight of everything she had failed to see until that moment. Tears of true remorse began to fall, her carefully held composure cracking under the weight of her son's forgiveness. She turned to the boy's father, who watched her with caution, his face weary but understanding. "We need to do better," she said quietly, the sincerity in her voice undeniable. He nodded, his expression soft but tired. "I agree," he said, his voice thick with emotion, knowing that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but for their son's sake, they would try. Weeks passed, and though things weren't perfect, the changes were there. One afternoon, the boy's parents were seen sitting side by side at his school play, their smiles polite but genuine, exchanging glances as they both recorded their son's performance on their phones. It wasn't flawless, but it was a start. It was progress. And for the boy, that was enough. As he stood on the stage, his smile, unburdened, carefree, and radiant, was the kind of smile he hadn't shown in months. The lesson was clear. The truth, no matter how hard to hear, held the power to heal. The innocence of a child, untainted by resentment or fear, could remind adults of what truly mattered: love, understanding, and a willingness to do better for those we care about. In this case, it was the unwavering love of a little boy that forced two adults to confront their shortcomings and take the first steps toward a healthier, more hopeful future. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on the importance of honesty and communication in our relationships, especially for the sake of those we love. Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire us to embrace the power of truth and compassion.